On Christmas Day 2011, 67-year-old Hervey Medellin turned off the oven in his apartment in Hollywood, California, opened up the oven door, and pulled out a casserole dish covered with foil. Hervey looked up at the clock and smiled, because his friend, who was coming over for a holiday visit, would be there any minute, and the food he was making had finished cooking at exactly the right time. He turned down the radio playing Christmas music in the kitchen and called out to his roommate, Gabriel Martinez, and told him lunch was almost ready. Gabriel had his eyes glued to his laptop, totally engrossed in whatever it was he was doing, and so he just gave Hervey a sort of grunt of acknowledgement. Hervey responded with an irritated sigh. Gabriel, who was 30 years younger than Hervey, had been spending so much time online lately that he barely connected with the world around him. Hervey realized it was very likely a generational thing, but he didn't understand why anyone would want to spend so much time just staring at a computer screen. But Hervey refused to be bothered by Gabriel today. It was Christmas, and Christmas was a time for joy, friends, and good food. Hervey set down the hot casserole dish on the table in the small dining area, and he looked around with satisfaction at all the Christmas decorations he had spent hours hanging up. Hervey's entire one-bedroom apartment now looked like it had been decorated by a professional interior designer. But perhaps the most impressive part of the decorations was not actually the Christmas stuff. It was the paintings that were hanging on the walls. These were not paintings that would be found in most small one-bedroom apartments. These were original works by famous artists. Just then, the doorbell rang, interrupting Hervey's thoughts, and Hervey removed his oven mitts and went to open the door. And when he did, he saw his friend Amelia standing there, holding several wrapped presents. Hervey grinned and said Merry Christmas and gave Amelia a big hug. Then he led her inside and told her to put the presents down because before they got to presents and to food, he had to show her something. Amelia put down the presents, said hello to Gabriel, and then Hervey took her hand and led her across the front room. Then Hervey pointed to a painting hanging on the wall, and he could hear Amelia gasp. She turned to Hervey almost in disbelief and asked if it was an original. Hervey smiled and nodded. He said the last time he'd gone down to Mexico, where he was originally from, he had acquired this painting, which was an original work of art by Diego Rivera, one of the most famous Mexican painters to have ever lived. After staring at this painting with his friend for several minutes, Hervey said it was time to go eat. He told Gabriel to put his computer away for a while and join them, and then the three of them headed to the table and dug into the casserole Hervey had prepared. While they ate, Hervey told Amelia more about his latest trip to Mexico and also about the travel plans he was making to destinations all over the world. Hervey said sometimes he still couldn't believe this was actually his real life. He'd worked so hard from the moment he came to the United States as a young man, with the hope that one day he'd be able to do whatever he wanted. And now he felt like he'd accomplished that. He was retired and filling his days with adventure and art. Hervey, Amelia, and Gabriel spent the day eating, talking, laughing, and exchanging gifts. For Hervey, who had spent most of his life far away from his family, this really felt like the perfect holiday. And other than maybe traveling, he couldn't imagine a better way to spend his time than eating delicious food and catching up with friends. By late afternoon, Amelia said unfortunately she had to go home, so Hervey walked her to the door. He gave her another big hug, wished her Merry Christmas again, and said he couldn't wait to get together with her in the new year. More than 3 weeks later, on the morning of Tuesday, January 17th, a dog walker named Lauren Kornberg left her house with her mother and 9 dogs. They headed toward their usual hiking path, which cut through an area called Bronson Canyon. Bronson Canyon is located inside of Griffith Park, which is basically LA's equivalent to New York's Central Park, but it sits high above the city. It was the perfect winter morning in Los Angeles, which meant it was a crisp 50 degrees and the Hollywood Hills were bathed in soft orange sunlight. So Lauren and her mom took the dogs up a side path that branched out from the main hiking trail, and once they were far enough away from other hikers, they let the dogs off leash. And as soon as that happened, the dogs instantly began playfully running around together, but one of them, a golden retriever, broke away from the pack and wandered over toward a bushy area next to a shallow ravine off the side of the path. And this golden retriever began digging in this one area of the brush. Lauren watched as the retriever pulled out a plastic bag from the brush and then began sniffing it. And as the dog began to sort of vigorously paw at this bag, a large round object suddenly rolled out of it and began tumbling down into the ravine. Two other dogs from the group, a husky and a small terrier, ran down the ravine after this big round object. And Lauren's mom asked what had just rolled out of the bag. Lauren said she didn't know, but it sort of looked like a movie prop, which wouldn't actually be an unusual thing to find lying around, because there were Hollywood special effects and prop houses not too far from here, and many movies and TV shows were filmed in this area. Lauren's mom walked over toward the ravine to try to get a better look at this movie prop, but as she got close to the edge, she looked down and saw that the dogs were no longer playing. In fact, the terrier was backing away from this object with its hair up, like the dog was terrified. And so Lauren, she kind of leaned forward and looked as best as she could to see what this object was. And suddenly, when one of the dogs stepped out of the way, she had a clear line of sight onto this object. And when she saw what it was, she began backing away too. Because the object was no prop. It was a real severed human head. About an hour later, helicopters loudly hovered over the canyon, and police blocked access to the entire area, as more than a dozen LAPD cruisers, CSI units, and news vans parked along the nearby scenic overlook. Detective Chuck Knowles and his partner, Detective Lisa Sanchez, walked up the trail and met with the uniformed officers who had cordoned off the area with police tape. By this point, crime scene investigators had retrieved the severed head from the ravine and brought it onto the trail. When Detective Sanchez walked over to them and saw the severed head, her stomach churned. She had investigated her fair share of murder cases, but this was the first time she dealt with any kind of dismemberment. As Sanchez began to study the head, one of the uniformed officers walked up to her and told her that the two women who actually found the head at first thought it was fake. They thought it was a movie prop. Detective Sanchez could understand why, because there was very little decomposition, and the head was so fresh and pristine that it looked like it had just been removed. From the looks of it, Sanchez believed the head belonged to a man who could be in his 60s, but that was about all she could guess about the victim at this point. So police began fanning out and searching the area, hoping to find some more clues. More helicopters and search units began to pour into the area, and the search expanded to a 7-acre radius. Searchers began entering backyards of the homes in the area, and some of these homes were really expensive houses that belonged to famous movie stars, so the police knew this case was going to draw even more media attention. Around 4:30 p.m., the sun began to set, and despite an exhaustive search of the area, no further human remains turned up. So the searchers left their equipment, kept the area cordoned off, and went home for the night. That evening, reports of the dismembered body found in Griffith Park were all over local news stations. And although violent crime in LA was far from rare, violent crime in this particular neighborhood in Bronson Canyon was almost unheard of. The people who lived in the neighborhood, who were willing to talk on camera, were shocked that something like this could happen just beyond their backyards. People who had been hiking and walking their dogs in Bronson Canyon for years told reporters they were now afraid to step foot on the hiking paths until the killer or killers were apprehended. The following day, LAPD returned to Bronson Canyon and performed a highly organized grid search, scouring the area where the head had turned up. The police were already feeling pressure from the media, city leaders, and local residents to find the people or person who had committed this horrific crime. But Detectives Knowles and Sanchez knew there was still so much physical area to cover and search, and they still had no idea who the victim even was. So this just didn't seem like a case they could just wrap up in a couple of days. And by late morning, the searchers had still found nothing new when a police truck pulled up and a dog handler stepped out with her cadaver dog, a German shepherd named Indiana Bones, who was famous for being the first four-legged detective on LA County Coroner's team. After getting out of the car, Indy's handler began leading the dog up a nearby hill, and almost immediately as they began to walk, Indy pulled the handler in the direction of this nearby dirt mound. The handler walked over to the mound and, with a gloved hand, began pushing the dirt aside, revealing what looked like a shallow grave. And in this shallow grave was a plastic bag. The handler reached her hands down and carefully cupped them beneath the bag and gently pulled it out of the ground. Then she took a pair of scissors out of her pocket, cut the bag open, and looked inside. and inside she saw a pair of human feet and a hand. The next morning, Detective Knowles and Sanchez sat at their computers sifting through recent missing person reports. The victim's torso, or any more of his body, still had not been found. But the detectives hoped that the feet and hand that were found also belonged to their victim, and that with these new body parts, they might be able to connect their victim to somebody who went missing in the area. Just then, the sound of a fax machine broke their focus. Knowles stood up, tore the paper off the machine, and saw that the medical examiner had completed his examination on the severed hand, feet, and head. Knowles scanned the whole report and then read aloud the important parts to Sanchez. The medical examiner had confirmed that all those body parts belonged to the same victim. Also, they said that after the victim was dead, his killer carefully cut apart the man's body, right at the joints in a very precise manner, so whoever cut the body up seemed to really know what they were doing. But what was even more intriguing was that the body parts had been refrigerated before they were dumped, which explained why the head had looked so fresh when it was found. But this made it difficult for the medical examiner to pin down exactly when the victim was killed. However, because the parts were so fresh, the examiner was able to lift very clear fingerprints from the man's fingers. And when he ran those prints through a system, he got a hit. The dismembered man was Hervé Medellin. Knowles sat down at his computer and ran Hervé's name through every database he had access to. And he quickly learned that Hervé had been reported missing just a day before his head was found. The missing persons report had been filed by a man named Gabriel Martinez, who said he was Hervé's roommate. So Detective Knowles and Sanchez got into their car and began driving towards Hervé's apartment, which happened to be just 2 blocks away from the Hollywood police station. While they were in the car, Knowles and Sanchez discussed their game plan for when they talked to this roommate. And their plan was simple: reveal nothing. Although news of the grisly discovery was already all over town, that victim's identity had not yet been released by the media. Only the police knew that information. And so they wanted to feel out what Hervé's roommate knew and didn't know. He was not a suspect yet, but he was definitely a person of interest. The detectives parked at the curb and walked up to Hervé's building. It was this elegantly plain, narrow building constructed in the 1920s that felt totally vintage and old Hollywood. The detectives walked up the stairs to the 3rd floor, to apartment 319, and rang the doorbell. A few seconds later, the door opened and a dark-haired man in his 30s greeted the detectives. They introduced themselves and asked if he was Gabriel Martinez. Gabriel said yes, and then asked immediately if they had news about Hervé. Had they found him? Was he okay? The detectives exchanged a quick glance, and then Sanchez said they were still investigating Hervé's disappearance. And for now, they just needed to speak to Gabriel to try to help with that case. Gabriel suddenly went from being sort of hopeful to looking pretty concerned, but then told them he was glad to tell them anything they wanted, and he asked them to come inside. Once inside, they all sat down at the table in the small dining area. Detective Knowles asked Gabriel when he'd last seen Hervé, and Gabriel said not since shortly after Christmas, on December 27th. That's when Hervé had gone to Mexico. It was where he grew up and where he still had friends and family. Gabriel said that Hervé traveled internationally a lot, and sometimes he would go on these open-ended trips, so Gabriel was not always exactly sure when Hervé was going to come home again. But Hervé had been calling pretty regularly just to check in, and then suddenly the call stopped. So Gabriel started to get really worried and then eventually filed the missing person report. Detective Sanchez asked Gabriel if he had called or texted Hervé after Hervé stopped calling, just to see if maybe he was staying in Mexico longer. Gabriel said he hadn't, but he explained that Hervé had actually left his cell phone behind at the apartment because he didn't get service in Mexico. Now, Gabriel knew there were ways around that, but he said discussing technology with Hervé was usually a losing cause. Hervé just preferred to use a landline and an international calling card whenever he was in Mexico. Sanchez asked if there was a record of these calls from Hervé, and Gabriel said yes, and he grabbed his phone and showed the detectives the calls he'd received from Hervé in January. The detectives saw that these calls were from an international calling card number, which meant they didn't actually know who placed those calls, but it did corroborate what Gabriel had told them. The detectives would talk to Gabriel for a bit longer, but the whole time they stuck to their original plan. They didn't reveal anything about Hervey's murder. Back at the station, Detective Knowles and Sanchez went over what they had so far, and they agreed it was not very much. And what little they did have didn't quite add up. And it really had to do with this trip to Mexico they had just learned about. Did Hervey really go to Mexico and then get murdered and dismembered there? And then his body parts were shipped back to LA and dumped in LA? Or did Hervey come back from Mexico in one piece and then somehow get intercepted before he got home by somebody who then murdered, dismembered, and dumped him? Both these theories just seemed like they were missing something. Like, did Hervey really even go to Mexico? They didn't know. I mean, regardless of what Hervey's roommate Gabriel had told them, the detectives thought it actually made a whole lot more sense that somebody would have killed and dismembered Hervey right there in his own apartment and disposed of him in nearby Griffith Park, which certainly made Gabriel seem very suspicious. The following day, which is now 3 days after Hervey's head had been found, the detectives returned to Hervey's apartment, and this time they showed up with a search warrant, a team of police, and cadaver dogs. Once inside, they let the dogs loose, and the dogs began frantically sniffing around the floorboards, the furniture, and the corners of every room. Meanwhile, Gabriel sat at the table and watched in silence as the investigators practically tore up the tiny one-bedroom apartment. The search team rifled through drawers and closets, they confiscated computers and phones, and they photographed every item inside the apartment. But at the end of the search, they realized they had found absolutely nothing. There was no blood, no hidden torso, no bone saws or other dismemberment tools, and so this apartment just didn't appear to be the place where the murder or dismemberment or both took place. As the search team began to leave the apartment, Detectives Knowles and Sanchez sat down at the table with Gabriel. And Gabriel didn't look angry or raise his voice, but he wanted to know, what had changed since they spoke a day earlier that made the detectives feel like they could come into his and Hervey's home and tear it apart like this. Sanchez whispered something to Knowles, and then she finally broke the news to Gabriel. Those body parts that were found in the canyon that were all over the news belonged to Hervey. Hervey was deceased, and so now Hervey's death was being investigated as a homicide. Immediately, all the color drained from Gabriel's face. He said he couldn't believe it. This didn't seem real. Now, the detectives understood how upsetting this was for Gabriel, but they needed more information. So they pressed Gabriel for more details about Hervey's trip to Mexico. And so, for the next half hour, Gabriel, despite being in shock, was cooperative and answered every question and tried to give detectives any information at all that could be useful. Later that day, the two detectives returned to the station and went into an evidence room where everything collected from Hervey's apartment was laid out on a table. One of the evidence technicians in the room told the detectives that he happened to look at the photos taken of the apartment, and some of the victims' artwork hung on the walls was worth a ton of money. The Diego Rivera painting alone was likely worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, this struck the detectives as being really odd. According to the information Gabriel had provided, and based on what the detectives had learned from their databases, Hervey was a retiree, living on a small pension in a small one-bedroom apartment. So how was he also a serious art collector, able to acquire paintings that were potentially worth a small fortune? The following day, so now 4 days after Hervey's head was discovered, a call came through to Knowles' desk. The man on the other end introduced himself as a retired LAPD narcotics detective, and this retired detective said he'd been reading the newspaper that morning and happened to see that the dismembered victim from Griffith Park had been identified. And when he saw the name, Hervey Medellin, it immediately rang a bell. He said back in the early 1990s, when he was investigating a Mexican drug cartel, Hervey's name had come up in the investigation. And in fact, he had interviewed Hervey a couple of times. Knowles kept listening, but right away his mind began to race. A connection to Mexican cartels and drug trafficking could maybe explain how Hervey had enough cash to buy those famous paintings. The retired detective explained that Hervey had worked as a ticket taker for Mexicana Airlines, At that time, that airline was believed to have been used for drug smuggling. And Hervey had become a kind of personal concierge for the wives and girlfriends of drug cartel members. When these women would visit LA, Hervey would book their hotel rooms, arrange shopping trips, and give them dining recommendations. Now, none of that was illegal, so the narcotics detective had no reason to pursue Hervey. He ultimately just kind of became a minor character in a much bigger investigation. But now that this former detective found out that Hervey had turned up dead and dismembered, he wondered if maybe Hervey's connection to the drug cartels had gone much deeper than he realized. As Knowles listened, he was having the same type of thoughts. Was Hervey a drug mule? Were those paintings a form of payment from the cartels? Did Hervey fail to repay a debt, and did the cartel brutally murder him for it? After all, some Mexican cartels were known to behead and dismember some of their victims. Knowles thanked the retired detective for reaching out to him. He hung up and passed this new information along to his partner Sanchez. The detectives now realized they could be in over their heads. Poking the hornet's nest with a Mexican drug cartel is the kind of thing that gets people killed, even cops. Over the next week, Knowles and Sanchez started to pursue this new lead, but they quickly discovered that a potential run-in with a violent Mexican drug cartel was actually not the biggest issue they were facing. Instead, the big issue that kept setting them back was just old-fashioned bureaucracy. Getting Mexican law enforcement agencies to cooperate in any investigation was never really easy, but when the investigation involved the cartels, it seemed almost impossible. Mexican authorities weren't eager to anger the cartels or possibly jeopardize their own investigations into the drug trade just to assist LA cops on a homicide case. And when Knowles and Sanchez turned to federal law enforcement agencies in the United States, they ran into similar problems. The DEA and the FBI were running multiple investigations involving the cartels, and they could not put those at risk just because Hervey had been interviewed by a narcotics cop over 20 years ago. But the FBI did at least tell Knowles and Sanchez that they would dig into Hervey's financial records to see if he had a clear connection to the cartels before he was killed. In the meantime, the feds told the LA detectives to go ahead and stay away from the cartel stuff and just let them handle that. They should just focus on leads that were in the United States. Now, Knowles and Sanchez understood why the feds reacted that way, but they still felt like a huge lead, i.e. going after the cartels, had just been yanked out from under them. On top of that, the FBI had no reason to expedite finding these financial records because this was not their case, so there was no telling how long it would actually take the feds to provide them with any information. Feeling frustrated and a bit lost on what to do next, Knowles and Sanchez turned their focus back to the victim. The detectives reached out to Hervey's LA friends to learn more about who Hervey was. And the picture that began to emerge of Hervey was of a warm, friendly guy who had moved to LA from Mexico as a young man, who had worked hard and was now enjoying his retirement and living the American dream that he had always believed in. Now, Knowles and Sanchez didn't think any of this information really helped their case, and none of it seemed to make Hervey look like a guy who had deep ties to the drug trafficking world. The detectives would still need to hear back from the FBI, but if Hervey had been working with a cartel, he'd managed to keep it pretty secret. So the detectives just kept pushing forward, talking to everyone they could who knew Hervey. And finally, just when they felt like they were running out of people to interview, the detectives did learn something very interesting. Hervey's roommate, Gabriel, was not just his roommate. Gabriel was Hervey's boyfriend. Now, Gabriel had not told the detectives this, and they couldn't believe that he had kept this a secret across the 2 interviews they had done with him. Having an intimate relationship with the victim immediately put Gabriel at the top of the suspect list, and the fact that he had lied about the relationship made him look even more suspicious. So, Knowles and Sanchez called Gabriel into the station for another interview. But when they confronted him, instead of him getting defensive or trying to deny it, Gabriel readily admitted that he and Hervey were indeed in a relationship. He told the detectives he was just a very private person and felt uncomfortable sharing those kinds of details. Sanchez and Knowles did not believe Gabriel, and they told him that because he had hid this information, they felt like he could be hiding something else. But Gabriel insisted he wasn't hiding anything. And then without any further prompting, he opened up about his and Hervey's relationship. Gabriel told them all about how he and Hervey had met, how at first they were good friends, and then they fell in love and moved in together. And after several minutes of this, when the detectives were finally able to steer the conversation back to the weeks leading up to the murder, Gabriel's story about Hervey's trip to Mexico and the phone calls he got didn't change at all. By the end of the interview, Knowles and Sanchez really didn't know what to think. Gabriel had clearly held back information from them about the relationship with Hervey, but when confronted, he told them all about it and then hadn't changed or embellished his story at all from that point forward. And also, they had already searched the apartment and there was no evidence that connected Gabriel to the crime. Not long after this meeting, things only seemed to get worse for the two detectives. The FBI came back to them and told them that after doing some digging, they found that Hervey's financial records did not show any connection to any drug cartels, or any other known criminals for that matter. Now, they still couldn't completely rule out the cartel's involvement in this murder, but for now at least, this lead felt like a dead end. By mid-April, so 3 months after Hervey's head had been found, the LAPD finally released Hervey's remains to his family so they could have a proper funeral. Knowles and Sanchez couldn't help but feel like they had let Hervey and his family down. They were no closer to finding the killer or killers than they had been on day one of the investigation. And in the weeks following the funeral, Knowles and Sanchez started to get assigned new cases that required immediate action. Hervey's murder was slowly becoming a cold case. Until one day in June, so now 5 months after Hervey's head had been found, Detective Knowles' phone rang, and he had one of the most bizarre conversations he'd had in all his time working in homicide. The caller introduced himself as an investigator with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. For a second, Knowles thought somebody might be prank calling him, because it was not every day an LA detective gets a call from a Canadian Mountie. But the Mountie quickly told Knowles that he'd been made aware of the case from back in January with the severed head and limbs. And the Mountie said they had actually just had a very similar case up in Quebec. A video had been uploaded to the internet that showed this naked man tied to a bed and another individual, dressed all in black, repeatedly stabbing him with an ice pick. And then once the man was dead, the killer dismembered the body before sexually abusing the body and cannibalizing some parts of it. And as if that wasn't brutal enough, the killer then sent other parts of the body to members of Canadian Parliament and several different elementary schools. Detective Knowles just sat there on the phone in silence. I mean, this was a totally brutal and horrible story, but he couldn't see any real connection to Hervey's murder, aside from both victims having been dismembered. But the Mountie continued and said they had actually already arrested this internet killer. And this man, who was a Canadian citizen named Luca Magnotta, was obsessed with Hollywood. He had recently lived in Los Angeles, not far from where Hervey lived, where he acted in porn movies and worked as a male escort before going back to Canada. But the big thing, the real reason the Mountie had called Knowles in the first place, was that while Luca was living in Los Angeles, he kept a blog in which he wrote about his exploits. And one of the things he wrote about was the dismembered body found in Bronson Canyon. Hervey's body. After the call with the Mountie, Knowles quickly met with Sanchez, and the detectives decided the first thing they needed to do was figure out exactly when Luca had been in the United States to see if maybe he could have actually crossed paths with Hervey in late December or January, the time they believed Hervey was killed. They reached out to the agencies in the US and Canada that maintain customs data, and they were able to find out when Luca actually crossed the border into the US and when he went back into Canada. Then they dug into Hervey's customs data to try to nail down the exact time he traveled to Mexico and if and when he came back to the States, in order to see if he and Luca had been in LA at the same time. But while they were looking into this, they discovered something that totally shocked them and made them rethink everything about this investigation. They came to realize that the reason the case had stalled out was because they had been operating under a false assumption the whole time. And after making this huge discovery, Knowles and Sanchez believed they had finally cracked the case. Based on all the evidence gathered throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Hervey Medellin. At around 3 a.m. on December 27, 2011, the killer crept through Hervey's apartment to the bedroom. The door was cracked open, and the killer looked in and saw Hervey sleeping inside. The killer threw the door open, rushed the bed, and jumped on top of him. Hervey immediately woke up and began yelling as the killer tried to cup their hands over Hervey's mouth to muffle his screams. Hervey kept fighting back, but the killer wrapped their hands around his throat and began to squeeze. Hervey continued to yell, so the killer squeezed harder and harder, and after about 5 minutes of this, Hervey stopped struggling. His face was blue and his eyes were empty. He was dead. The killer remained in Hervey's apartment, and a bit later that morning, they opened up Gabriel's computer and did a search. They pulled up an article titled, "Butchering the Human Carcass for Consumption." This article provided detailed instructions on how to dismember a human body for the purpose of cooking and consuming it. Once the killer felt like they had a clear understanding of what to do, they went back to Hervey's bedroom and used a saw they had recently purchased to separate Hervey's head and limbs from his body. The killer then refrigerated those body parts for 3 weeks, but for reasons no one fully understands, the killer never actually consumed any of it. There was no cannibalism, despite clearly there being some level of interest based on that search that was done on Gabriel's computer on the night of the murder. And so 3 weeks after the murder, the killer walked through Bronson Canyon in the dark with Hervey's body parts and dug shallow graves at various spots and buried them. And soon after that, with Hervey now officially out of the picture, the killer was able to transfer all the money from Hervey's personal bank account into the joint bank account they had opened after they had moved in together. Gabriel Martinez murdered his boyfriend Hervey in the apartment they shared. It turned out that before Christmas of 2011, Gabriel and Hervey's relationship had started to completely fall apart. In fact, things had gotten so bad that Hervey told Gabriel he wanted to end things, and he said Gabriel should start looking for another place to live. Gabriel knew he would not be able to afford a Los Angeles apartment or lead the life he'd grown accustomed to on his own because he didn't have a steady income. He had become financially dependent on Hervey, and so, in his desperation, he had decided to kill Hervey and steal his money. On Christmas Day, when Hervey's friend Amelia came over, Gabriel sat on the couch with his laptop, Googling what tools to use to cut up a human body. Being Hervey's significant other and failing to disclose their relationship to police had made Gabriel a leading suspect early on, but police had found no clear evidence pointing to Gabriel or anyone else, so the case had gone cold. But it was the customs data that detectives obtained while following the lead on the Canadian internet killer, Luca Magnotta, that helped lead them back to Gabriel. Customs data showed that Luca had been in Canada at the time Hervey went missing, which ruled Luca out as the killer. But more importantly, this customs data made it clear that Hervey had never actually traveled or even booked a flight to Mexico at any time in late December or January. Gabriel had crafted this intricate lie about Hervey's trip, even providing phone records showing all the times Hervey had called him from Mexico. But once investigators knew Gabriel was lying, they dug deeper into his phone records and discovered the calls had actually come from Hervey's friend, who was calling Gabriel from Mexico, but they were doing so to find out why they had suddenly stopped hearing from Hervey. At this point, the detectives were sure Gabriel was the killer. But the final piece of evidence they would need to convince the district attorney would not be discovered until 2014, over 2 years after the murder. At that time, a city worker was digging in the ground not too far from where Hervey's head had been discovered, and he found a plastic bag containing pieces of decaying human flesh. A DNA sample of this flesh matched Hervey's DNA, but it was actually the bag itself that sealed Hervey's case, because this was a very specific type of bag, one that was used to protect and transport expensive paintings, and it matched those same types of bags that had been found in Hervey and Gabriel's apartment. Los Angeles detectives tracked Gabriel down in San Antonio, Texas, where he had married a wealthy woman who was supporting him, and with the help of local police, they arrested him. Gabriel was eventually found guilty of murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. On July 19, 2013, 49-year-old Matt Dyer climbed on board a tiny 19-seat Twin Otter airplane that was parked on the tarmac of the Montreal International Airport in Canada. Matt was about to take off on the first of 2 flights that would take him and 7 other adventurous people deep into one of the most remote and wild regions in North America. For Matt, this trip was going to be the most amazing journey of his life. He had seen the ad for this 2-week-long expedition about a year earlier when he was looking through a magazine put out by an environmental organization called the Sierra Club. Now, even though Matt was a lawyer, he didn't make much money. He lived in this tiny town in central Maine where he made a living by offering either free or very low-cost legal assistance for some of the state's poorest residents. But Matt was an avid outdoorsman, and when he saw the opportunity to explore one of Canada's newest national parks that was so far north it was practically in the Arctic Circle, he decided the hefty $6,000 price tag was well worth it. 2.5 hours later, after flying over 900 miles due north away from the airport in Montreal, the Twin Otter airplane that Matt and the others were riding on touched down on a narrow gravel landing strip situated between this huge forest on a mountainside and a river on the other side. After climbing off the plane with all of their equipment, Matt and the 7 others hustled their way over to this stretch of flimsy plywood buildings that lined the runway. These buildings and this entire area they were in was not a part of this new national park they were going to. This was like their staging area to prepare and get ready before catching another flight that would bring them into the park. And so Matt and the 7 other people he was with, which included the 2 trip leaders from the Sierra Club, they would stay at this temporary base camp for the next couple of days, going over their hiking routes and talking about emergency procedures and protocols. And then after those 2 days were up, the group felt like they were ready. And so the group packed up all their things and they boarded the tiny float plane out on the water that would take them to their final destination, this new Canadian national park, better known as the Torngat Mountains. 45 minutes later, the pilot of the float plane began to descend through the clouds to make their landing on a little water inlet. And as the pilot did that, Matt and the 7 others were able to look out the window and actually see the Torngat Mountains for the first time. Now, all of them had seen dozens and dozens of pictures of this area, but seeing it for the first time in person was still shocking. The area looks like an alien planet.
The wilderness in and around the Torngots is not the same kind of wilderness we think of when we think about going hiking in the forest or going camping or something. No, the wilderness in the Torngots is primordial. It's like you're looking out at a place from the very beginning of time, like dinosaurs should be walking around this area. As far as Matt could see, in any direction were these huge, jagged mountains that had been carved out of the earth by glaciers hundreds of thousands of years ago. And those same glaciers had created hundreds of waterways between the mountains called fjords that almost looked like blue-veined fingers. And even from high up in the plain, Matt could look down and the water of these fjords were so clear that he could see these speckled backs of brown trout swimming beneath the surface. But while this landscape was undoubtedly spectacularly beautiful and pristine and totally incredible, it was equal parts unwelcoming to people. There are no roads in the Torngots, there's no campsites, there's no facilities, there's no internet, there's no cell phone, and the weather is unbelievably harsh. It's freezing cold and wet most of the time, and then even when it's a little bit warm and a little bit nice there, the weather can change in an instant and become freezing cold and wet all over again. And so, as such, the handful of visitors that go into this area every year are expected to be 100% self-reliant, because this really is one of the most dangerous wild regions in the world. But for Matt, as he looked out his window and surveyed this landscape, he wasn't second-guessing his decision to go into this hostile environment. No. I mean, the reason he was willing to fork over all that money to go on this trip is because he really wanted to experience extreme wilderness firsthand. And so finally, the pilot of the float plane came into land on this little water inlet, and then the pilot ferried the craft over to this beach, and then Matt and the 7 others piled off onto land with all of their things, and then as the pilot turned around and left, the 2 Sierra Club trip leaders, a 61-year-old man named Rich Gross and a 60-year-old woman named Marta Chase, told the group to pick up their things and follow them. And so Rich and Marta led the hikers about 500 feet away from where they had just been dropped off, up to this slightly elevated, mostly flat area that kind of overlooked the fjord and had this incredible view of all the mountains around them. Now, unlike the temporary base camp they had been at for the past couple of days, this camp was nowhere near any forests. They were basically on a wide open plain that kind of went right up into these mountains. So it's very wide open where they're staying. And so after Rich and Marta instructed the group where to set up their tents, Matt and the others got to doing that, and then after they were all set up, Rich and Marta put a small electric fence around the perimeter of their tents to keep any nosy animals out, and then the group headed up a little bit higher on this mountain near them to take their first group photo. And in this photo, they all look so happy and so excited for what's to come. And over the next couple of days, their trip would go exactly to plan. During the daytime hours, they would hike all of their pre-planned hiking routes all over the mountains and down near the water. And at night, they would eat their food and drink fresh water from the fjord and swap stories from back home. But their perfect trip was about to become a nightmare. The story. In the early evening hours of Tuesday, July 23rd, so 2 days after the group arrived in the Torngot Mountains, Matt and the others returned from one of their hikes. Now, the day had been cold and rainy, but the group was in good spirits. This was their last day at this particular camping spot. The next morning, they were going to pack up and head farther inland to their next camping spot. After Matt and the others had put their gear back inside of their tents, they came back out to see that Rich and Marta, the 2 trip leads, had organized a special feast for the group to celebrate the successful beginning of their trip. And so the group all sat around eating salami and crackers and drinking rum mixed with lemonade as they talked excitedly about the next couple of days and what they could expect. At some point during the festivities, Matt was tired, and so he broke away from the group. He climbed back inside of his tent, got inside of his sleeping bag, and before long, he was fast asleep. A few hours later, around 3:30 in the morning, Matt suddenly woke up. He had no idea what had woken him up, and so for a second, he just lay there listening to the outside world and just kind of staring straight up. Now, the moon was out that night, so there was some illumination, and as he looked straight up at the underside of his tent, he sees this huge figure move across the side of his tent and then stop right on top of him. And then before Matt's brain could process what was happening, this huge figure began pressing down on the fabric of Matt's tent. And so he's seeing his tent collapsing in on him. Matt's not doing anything. He's not saying anything. He's just watching in horror. And then suddenly the tent rips open and these two arms reach into the tent and they grab at Matt. And Matt threw his hands up in defense and screamed out for help. And as he did that, he suddenly felt this vice-like grip on the top of his head, and then before long, he was being pulled out of the hole in his tent out into the night. And as Matt is being dragged along on the ground, having no idea what's going on, he can't move. All he can hear is this crunching sound, which he would later find out was the sound of his skull and jaw breaking. And he started to smell this horrible rotten fish smell, and then he felt what felt like saliva coming over his face. And then Matt began kind of trying to look around because he couldn't really move his head, and he noticed all he could see was white fur. And it was then that Matt realized he was in the jaws of one of the world's most powerful and deadliest predators. Standing 10 feet tall on its hind legs and weighing as much as 1,700 pounds, the North American polar bear sits right on top of the Arctic food chain. And now this apex predator was dragging Matt by the skull down to the beach where Matt knew he would be eaten, even if Matt was still alive when the eating began. When the bear first ripped open Matt's tent and bit down on the top of his skull, Matt let out that scream, and it actually woke up the entire camp. And one of the first people to emerge from their tents to see what was going on was one of the trip leaders, Marta. And so she jumps out of her tent, and just 3 feet away from her, she sees this huge polar bear on its hind legs diving into the tent to get after Matt. And so Marta instinctively yells out to Rich to get his flare gun, and she dove back into her tent to retrieve her own flare gun. But by the time she and Rich had both emerged, gun in hand, this polar bear had already dragged Matt 200 feet away from the camp. And by this point, the other hikers in the group had also emerged from their tents, and after realizing what was going on, they just stood there, absolutely paralyzed with shock, staring at this bear dragging one of their companions down to the beach to be killed. Then, after Rich fired his flare gun generally in the direction of the bear, it kind of snapped the group out of their paralysis, and then moments later, they were all screaming and banging pots and pans to try to terrify the bear into releasing Matt from its jaws. Matt couldn't hear the sounds of his companions calling out to try to save him, nor did Matt feel any pain. He was in shock. The only thing going through Matt's head as he was being dragged along the ground to the beach was, I'm going to die. I'm either going to die on the way to the beach, or when I get there, then when the bear starts eating me, I'm going to die. And when he thought about this, it was with a kind of eerie, calm detachment. Like he wasn't sad or mad. It was just kind of a fact. This was going to happen. But as Matt was kind of making peace with his reality, Rich fired that flare gun shot, and that ball of chemical fire exploded basically right in front of the polar bear's face. And the polar bear, who was startled by the flare, instinctively whipped its head to the side, up, and then down again, and it didn't let go of Matt. And so Matt was whipped like a rag doll up, and then was slammed down into the ground. And when Matt hit the ground, he heard the sound of his neck breaking. But as Matt was laying there, the bear released him from its jaws, and then behind Matt, the bear turned around and began walking away. And so Matt could hear the sound of its big paws moving away from him, and suddenly Matt's thinking, oh my God, I might survive this. And so he tried to lay as still as he possibly could so as not to attract any attention, and he began repeating in his head over and over and over again, please bear, go away, please bear, go away. But as if out of a horror movie, as Matt is laying there repeating this phrase, he hears the sound of this bear stopping, turning around, and start moving back towards him. And so Matt's just thinking, okay, it's going to come back over here, it's going to bite my head, and that's the end. But luckily, Rich, by this point, one of the trip leads, had run down closer to the beach, reloaded his flare gun, and right as this bear was going to bite Matt again, Rich had fired that flare, and once again, the chemical fire had kind of exploded right near the bear, causing it to get startled. It turned around, it ran off, and this time the bear did not return. It would turn out Rich and Marta, the two trip leaders from the Sierra Club, had chosen a location for this campsite that was so heavily trafficked by polar bears, it was referred to as a polar bear highway. When all of the hikers, which included Marta and Rich, had been given their safety brief when they were staying in those plywood structures at that base camp near the runway, well, part of the brief was whenever you make camp in the Torngots, you want to be at least a quarter mile away from water. Go way inland because the polar bears hunt and fish and walk around right along the edge of these fjords. But despite all 7 members of this Sierra Club expedition being experienced wilderness backpackers, none of them really appreciated just how dangerous it was to be camping or even hiking around in known polar bear territory. And so this is why they ultimately ignored the safety brief and set up their first camp just a couple hundred feet away from the water's edge. And even prior to the attack on Matt, when the group literally saw polar bears wandering around near their camp and even at one point had to fire their flare guns at the polar bears to get them to leave, the group still decided it was best to stay at this particular campsite. Perhaps they believed their electric fence they had set up around the perimeter of their tents would protect them from these polar bears, but obviously that had not been the case. The bear that attacked Matt had been totally unaffected by their fence. Matt would survive this attack, but really only because one of the members of the expedition happened to be a medical doctor, and so they were able to stabilize Matt until help arrived. Matt's injuries were extensive. They included a broken skull, a broken jaw. He had slash marks and puncture wounds all over his head and his neck, and all of those wounds got horribly infected. And also his voice was permanently changed as well because the bear also slashed his vocal cords. Following the attack on Matt, Parks Canada, which is the agency that oversees all of Canada's national parks, including Torngots, has mandated that any organization going into Torngots National Park has to have a polar bear protection plan in place. As for Matt, he does not make a big deal about his near-death experience. In fact, he kind of makes light of it and sometimes even makes jokes about it. As for the polar bear that attacked him, Matt holds no ill will. If anything, the attack has made him more interested and appreciative of the apex predator. In August of 2014, so 11 months after Matt's brush with death, he returned to the Torngots and even visited the actual site of the attack, perhaps to get closure. Except this time, he was in the company of an armed polar bear expert. On September 27, 2018, in a little city in the Netherlands, a security camera captured 6 men walking calmly toward this brick bungalow inside one of the country's holiday parks. A holiday park is a place that offers cheap accommodations to tourists. They typically have things like campsites, RV parking, cheap bungalows for rent, and they also often offer things like swimming and golfing and bowling, so it's kind of like an all-in-one for families on vacation. But on this September day, these 6 men caught on camera were neither family nor on vacation. Instead, as they walked, it was very clear from their body language that the only thing they were interested in was getting inside of their holiday bungalow. Once they did reach the front door of this bungalow, the apparent leader of the group, who had dark brown hair and a full beard, he pulled out a key, unlocked the door, he opened it up, and then he made sure the rest of the men took off their shoes before walking inside. And then once all the men were inside the door, the leader shut the door and locked it behind them, and then barefoot, they walked through the hallway into this corner living room in the back of the bungalow. And in this room, there was this L-shaped couch that was centered on a coffee table and a couple of chairs scattered throughout the rest of the room. And so the 6 men kind of took up seats in these different places. And then after they were all sitting down, 2 of the men who had been seen walking into the bungalow carrying backpacks and duffel bags, they pulled those bags out and set them on the coffee table. And as soon as these 2 men did that, the other 4 men who had been chatting amongst themselves went completely silent and turned and just faced the bags on the table. It was very clear that whatever was in the bags was very significant. So significant, in fact, fact that the group had pulled most of the curtains across all of the windows inside of this bungalow to make sure no one outside could look in and potentially see the contents of these bags. And once the two men unzipped the duffel bags and backpack and began putting the contents of the bags onto the table, it became incredibly clear why the men were so on edge. Inside of these bags were guns, and in the Netherlands, no private citizen is allowed to possess them. Over the next hour, the two men who had actually carried the guns into the bungalow, they began going over some instruction with the other four men of how to use these slick black pistols and AK-47 rifles. They taught them how to load the guns and reload and how to aim, and they did a number of dry firing exercises, which is basically pulling the trigger on any real gun when the gun is not loaded. And so these four students paid careful attention to their two instructors, and at some point they became more confident, and you could just see the excitement was building in the room. At one point, one of the students grabbed two of the AK-47 rifles and held one in each arm and pretended to fire them simultaneously, like you would see in the Rambo movies. But when one of the two instructors reached back into one of these bags and pulled out a new item, a vest, and laid it on the coffee table, immediately the mood in the room shifted again. Now the students seemed more nervous than excited. One of the four students eventually walked forward and somewhat reluctantly extended his arm to allow the instructor to slip the vest onto him. And then once the vest was put on the student, you can see in the camera footage, there are pockets all over this vest with little wires poking out of them. This vest was a suicide vest, and the pockets contained explosives. As one of the instructors showed the student in the vest which cord to pull in order to detonate himself, you can hear in the background someone saying, "When the police come, you can take them with you." A little over 2 hours later, the six men were done, and they began packing up their arsenal of new weapons back into the bags, and then they stood up to leave. But when they left, it was the students who had the bags of weapons, not the two instructors. Once the six men had left the bungalow and were back outside again, they put their shoes back on, they locked the bungalow behind them, and then the two instructors were seen on camera walking away from the bungalow to a separate car. They drove off, and then the four men that now had the weapons, they walked to a nearby white cargo van, which contained one other man who had not been inside of the bungalow with them, but he was very much a part of this group. He was their driver. And so as the four men with guns approached the white van, the driver saw them, he climbed out, he ran around to the back and opened up the back doors that led into the windowless back cargo area of the van, and the four men with guns, they climbed inside, the driver shut the van, climbed back into the driver's seat, and then before long, the driver was leaving the parking lot and heading north towards the city of Amsterdam, which is the capital of the Netherlands. Every year, Amsterdam plays host to one of the largest gay pride parades and events in the world. The location is significant to the LGBTQ community because it was here in 2001 that the first gay marriage bill was signed into law, making the Netherlands the first country in the world to legalize gay marriage. So, for 1 week a year, hundreds of thousands of people pour out onto the streets and line the canals of Amsterdam, all drawn together to affirm gay rights and to celebrate their sexual expression, preference, and identity. And the men in the white windowless van intended to use their new weapons and training to kill or maim as many parade goers as possible. They were hopeful that their terrorist attack would rival or even eclipse the attack from 2015 in Paris in a nightclub that killed or injured more than 500 people and sent shockwaves through Europe. 30 minutes later, the four men in the back of this windowless van felt the van slow down and pull off the main road and not come to a complete stop, but just kind of begin to slow roll, which was odd because they had no reason to slow down and they were at least 30 minutes away from their destination. And so instinctively, the men reach down and make sure their guns are safely stowed inside of their bags and out of sight in case somebody opens the back door. They don't want people to know they have guns. They are illegal. And so as the van continued to go painfully slowly for really no reason that was clear, the men in the back of the van were really starting to worry that something was wrong. Now remember, they have no windows. They can't look outside. They don't know what's going on. However, there was a small crack in the partition that separated the back of the van from the front of the van where the driver was. And so the men in the back of the van began craning their necks and looking through this little crack to try to see if they could understand what was in front of the van and, why the driver had stopped. And when these men looked through that that little crack and they saw what was out there, they immediately began to panic. They began reaching down and fumbling for their bags, trying to open them up to get their guns. And then by the time they're kind of getting the guns into their hands, all the doors on the van fly open and the men in the back just begin firing their guns blindly at the open doors. But when they pull their triggers, nothing happens because their guns were fake. They had been sold to them by the people who were flinging open their doors, the police in tactical gear with their dogs, and they knew these guys had fake guns. They knew their suicide vests were fake. They were full of fake explosives. They have nothing lethal inside of this van. And so the police, they just fling the doors open and send in the dogs. And so the dogs, they jump into this van and these wannabe terrorists are screaming and they're firing their fake guns at the dogs as the dogs are shredding these terrorists to bits. And then whenever they tried to jump out, the police would just pistol whip the terrorists until finally all of these wannabe terrorists were in the fetal position crying, or they were crouched down with their hands over their head. It would turn out the two instructors who had brought the duffel bags of guns into the bungalow with the other men, they were not other fellow terrorists. They were undercover police officers who were a part of the special national anti-terrorism team who were able to infiltrate this terrorist cell. These undercover cops were the ones who sold the fake guns and fake explosives to the terrorists, and they were the ones who set up this meeting at the bungalow, which allowed them to place cameras and listening devices all over the place. Plus, they were also able to bug the white van because they knew they would be departing the bungalow inside of it. So all the wannabe terrorists that you saw on camera, plus two others that were not seen on camera but were totally involved, were all sentenced on October 8th, 2020 to anywhere from 10 to 17 years in prison. Meanwhile, the Amsterdam Pride Parade went off without a hitch.